We tend to think maybe self inquiry and surrender are two different things, and they both apparently lead to the same goal. But I think that's not the way Ramana Maharshi spoke about it, and neither is it the way it reveals itself when we actually look into both. Because, first of all, the very idea of a goal that is separate from us and then having two different paths, let's say in this case, self inquiry or surrender to reach that goal, is all essentially based on a certain sense of imagining a distance between us and the goal in time or space and reaching there. It's a common metaphor that's used. But the same Ramana Maharishi has multiple times said that you are already where you are looking for. He used to give the example of you're already in Ramanashram and you are asking me how to get to Ramanashram. So clearly, the goal we are looking for is already here and now, which means he has indicated multiple times that it is not a goal in time or a goal in space, and therefore it is not something which has multiple paths which are different to reach there because the journey is the destination. So then, why would he say that there is two ways, self inquiry and surrender? Uh, because I think it is only a question of the emphasis, because there are other places where he has said that self inquiry and surrender are one and the same. So, how can it be that they are two ways and yet one and the same? It's more like two sides of the same coin. It's the same coin, so it's one and the same, and yet it's two sides of it, or which side we look at it. When we look at it from the perspective of asking the question, inquiring who am I, we can see that all the various identities with which we associate ourselves, whether it's the body or thoughts or emotions, great positive experiences, depressing negative experiences, all of these that we associate the I with, and we say, I am happy, I am depressed, I am sad, I am angry, I am Indian, I am American, all the various ways in which we associate the I, all of these are clearly seen as coming and going and not the essential nature of I. So when we ask the question, who am I, and trace the question back to its source, we recognize that it is an awareness that is preceding all these identities that come and go. So any identity that comes and goes comes in the light of awareness and remains in the light of awareness and dissolves in the light of awareness. And the light of awareness is our being. It is not something someone else comes and shines a light for me to know the egoic identity that seems to take on an avatar at that particular moment. So there is a light of awareness within in which this play of forms and the play of identities comes and goes. So that's self inquiry, to see clearly that I am not the body, I am not the mind, I am not thoughts, I am not emotions, not in an intellectual way, but directly by perceiving the light of awareness within us, in which all these identities come and go. And surrender is the flip side of it, to see that all these identities come and go on their own through a force which is completely outside our perception of any sense of control. So I don't, when I look at it from the perspective of where the I rises from, in terms of all the identities. I don't control the body is functioning in its own way. The breathing happens on its own, the digestion happens on its own, the senses function on their own. The seeing, the smelling, the tasting, hearing, touching, they all happen on their own. And there is a tremendous intelligence that happens. So when I look at it from the perspective of surrender, I see that there is an infinite force, energy, power that is making all this happen. And I am not doing it. There is no I seeing, but the seeing happens. There is no I hearing, but the hearing happens. And same with thinking, when a thought rises, I am not thinking, it's the thought that rises. If I look closely, why I think a thought at a given moment is completely not in our control. What people come in and what kind of impressions we have in our memory, and how those impressions come about as thoughts, and the situations that we get into that define our thoughts, words, and actions. None of this is in our control. First of all, we are born with a certain genetic programming which we have never chosen, and then we are exposed to a bunch of environmental conditioning through our childhood, our parents, our schools, none of which was under our control. And all of that make up the so called I that we consider ourselves to be. And so when I look at it from the perspective of surrender, all I see is that there is an infinite energy, which we call God, Ishvara in Sanskrit, which is making all this happen, the Shakti, the power. So when I acknowledge that I am not in control of this body, I'm not in control of thoughts, I'm not in control of emotions, everything happens by this one supreme mover. And the same supreme mover is what is moving every single aspect of the universe, from the smallest subatomic particle to the supergalactic movements. Everything is happening with the same intelligence. And that's exactly what even science reveals us, is that there is the same physical forces of gravity and electromagnetism and nuclear forces that's operating at all levels. So when I look at it from this perspective, I surrender to this supreme mover who is making this body function, all the bodies function, all of it function. There again, I recognize that there is no I. There is no individual I, because everything is happening according to the intelligence of the supreme mover. And therefore, I completely surrender to this. And in this act of surrender, there is no I anymore as a separate ego, but there is only a complete sense of silence and peace in which activities happen. And that silence, that peace is awareness. So if we look at it thus clearly, it becomes very clear that it's not just that there is no separate goal, but there are not even separate paths. Both self inquiry and surrender, also called as both jnana and bhakti, wisdom and devotion, they are exactly the same. They are just what we emphasize on depending on our particular mood. We may emphasize the surrender aspect or the inquiry aspect, but inquiry is not a dry intellectual process, and surrender is not some sentimental process either. Both of these are rooted in wisdom and in true devotion. So, this is why an interesting verse in Gita that I remember, where Krishna says, there are four types of devotees who come to me, and he says, the four are, I mean, it's so he says, those who are looking to be free of suffering. That's the one first type. Those who come out of desire for wealth and power and all this. So these are the two types of devotees who are coming for material reasons, who want to remove suffering. The second, to gain more material wealth or fame or power. But the third, he says, is the one who comes out of curiosity to know me. He's not interested in either gaining wealth, nor is he interested in even getting rid of suffering at a material plane, but he simply wants to know what is the true nature of God, what is my true nature. So it's in Sanskrit called Jignasu, the one who inquires, basically a seeker. And the fourth is a jnani, he says, the one who is fully realized. And why does Krishna say the fully realized jnani is the greatest? And then he goes on to say that of all the four, the dearest to me is the jnani. So he defines the dearest devotee as a jnani, which again goes to show that there is no distinction between jnana and bhakti. And in fact, the highest summit of devotion is jnana, and the highest summit of jnana is bhakti, because they are one and the same. When we recognize that there is no individual self, there is only one supreme mover, and which makes all that is manifest happen, and all of it happens in consciousness, then we simply remain as nothing and everything. So that's why Ramana Maharshi once said, in order to realize the self, you have to become nothing. Because as long as we are something, we are creating a separation between us and the rest of the world, which is all just one movement. There is just one movement that makes everything function. So when the separation goes, we recognize our true nature, and the separation goes through both of this, which are essentially two sides of the same coin, by recognizing that everything is done by the supreme mover, and which is devotion or surrender, or by seeing that all the things I take myself to be are coming and going within the space of awareness, which is inquiry, and both are essentially the same. And therefore there is no, not just that there is no contradiction between the two, there is not even any difference between the two. It's just a question of emphasis. And so one other important thing to also recognize, therefore, is that self-inquiry is never some intellectual process. It's not about some abstraction of thought, philosophy, none of that. It's actually going to the heart. That's why Ramana Maharshi always spoke of the heart. He said the nature of truth is heart, and therefore nature of devotion is also heart. So the true heart is opened through both Atma Vichara or self-inquiry and surrender or Sharanagati, and they are essentially the same.